All right, welcome back to another edition of the History of Being Human podcast. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong, still attempting to resurrect sense and meaning from the dust of a billion factoids. On this, the podcast that tries to figure out who we are by looking at where we've been and what we've done. There's one you haven't heard for a while. This is the holiday edition 2022 of the History of Being Human podcast. And to me, nothing says holiday like Friedrich Nietzsche. Specifically, the mysterious death of Friedrich Nietzsche. That's right, we're neck deep into an epic series on the mysterious deaths of historical figures. And the death of Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most mysterious for a couple of reasons. One of the most controversial, the most argued over deaths. It's a loaded question, what killed Friedrich Nietzsche? Part of the problem is, this is something where we have a lot of information. We have descriptions of his decline. We have descriptions of his mental state, his physical state, his appearance. And yet, despite all this, despite his death happening on the historical timescale very recently in the year 1900, and despite this being a literate age, and Nietzsche being a semi-famous figure, so there's extensive documentation, we still have no consensus, no generalized agreement on what killed him. 20 or 30 different theories have been offered, none of which commands the assent of the vast majority of historians. In fact, I'd go so far as to say, if you want to publish an academic paper, just offer some fringe or new theory about the death of Friedrich Nietzsche, back it up with 2 or 3 selective facts, and you have yourself a paper. Maybe it's not that bad, but that's what it seems like. And so today, in keeping with my intention of being the fool who wanders in where angels fear to tread, I'm going to wander into this arena and weigh in on the death of Friedrich Nietzsche. Today on the History of Being Human podcast. First of all, who was this Friedrich Nietzsche who died mysteriously? If you ask most people, they know him as the philosopher who came up with the famous, or infamous, pronouncement, God is dead, everything is permitted. But there's much more to Nietzsche than this simple act of iconoclasm. He has to rank among the most influential modern philosophers, and we'll talk about why. One thing that's hard to believe about Friedrich Nietzsche is that he was a baby once. I don't know why. There's some people it's really hard to believe that they were ever infants. And one of those people that's very hard for me to believe was ever an infant, or for that matter was ever a toddler, is Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. Just seems like someone that came out of the womb with his giant, vast forehead, his sweeping long hair, and his fierce mustache, fully formed, fully adult head, maybe on a little body. But as hard as it is to believe, statistics would argue that he was born, and he did grow up somewhere. And in Nietzsche's case, that was in southern Germany, a small village southwest of Leipzig, on October 15, 1844. In fact, it was the 49th birthday of his namesake, King Friedrich Wilhelm. It's interesting that this most irreverent and iconoclastic of philosophers would be the son and grandson of Lutheran ministers. His father and his paternal grandfather were respected Lutheran ministers and theologians. Not that Nietzsche would ever know his paternal grandfather, who died 18 years before Nietzsche was born. His own father, in fact, died when Nietzsche was only 5 years old. And 6 months after that, Nietzsche's younger brother, his 2-year-old brother, died. So Nietzsche was raised in a household with his mother, his grandmother, his aunts, and his sister. It was apparent from a young age that Nietzsche was destined for academic pursuits. Shortly after the death of Nietzsche's father and his younger brother, the family moved in with the grandmother in Naumburg. There Nietzsche attended first a boys' school and then a private school. According to academic records from that school, Nietzsche excelled at, guess what? Christian theology. Not surprising at all considering who his father and grandfather were. Although I have to admit, I'm not sure what it means to excel at Christian theology. Really not sure what kind of academic rigor is involved. Does that mean Nietzsche had the best argument for how many angels could fit on the head of a pin? Or whether prevenient grace was sufficient or insufficient? I really don't know. And the fact that he excelled at Christian theology should not be mistakenly interpreted to mean that he was a top student. His grades were not near the top of the class. Despite this, he was offered a scholarship to study at a very prestigious private school. The reason for that is because Nietzsche's father worked for the state. He worked for the state as a Protestant pastor. And one of the benefits of working for the state was that if you passed away, your children would be taken care of. In this case, Nietzsche was offered a scholarship to a very prestigious academy, the Forta School, a school in a former Cistercian monastery outside of Naumburg. And if you do look it up, it's spelled P-F-O-R-T-A, not just F-O-R-T-A. So the Forta School was where some of the brightest minds in Saxony studied. And the schooling there would be pretty intense. Among Nietzsche's friends, his classmates, would be famous composers, poets, famous Orientalists. Nietzsche had to learn Latin, Greek, French, and Hebrew. And we kind of know how Nietzsche did during these years. We have a few report card equivalents from that time. We know that Nietzsche excelled at German and religion, which is kind of ironic considering his future. He did okay at French, Greek, and Latin. He was dismal, though, or lackluster, as the report card said, at both Hebrew and mathematics. During his time at the Forta School, Nietzsche also began writing music. He became an amateur composer. In this, though, we have to admit he doesn't seem to have been very successful. In fact, the famous composer and pianist Hans van Bülow described Nietzsche's work as, quote, the most undelightful and the most anti-musical draft on musical paper that I have faced in a long time, end quote. So pretty harsh criticism from Hans van Bülow for the young Friedrich Nietzsche's compositions. And it was also at the Forta School where Nietzsche first showed his attraction to, should we call it that? His attraction to some rather controversial or even unsavory works. Among these was the poetry of one Ernst Ortleb. Ortleb was eccentric in his lifestyle, blasphemous in his poetry, and usually drunk. In fact, he was found dead in a ditch, having drunk himself to death a few weeks after Nietzsche met him. It's possibly under the influence of this Ortleb that Nietzsche and a student named Richter went out late one night and returned to the school drunk, where they were encountered by a teacher. This led to Nietzsche losing his status as a prefect of the school and also receiving a demotion in his class ranking. It's also at the Forta School where Nietzsche first showed signs of losing his traditional Christian faith, as among his reading were such heretical and controversial works as Life of Jesus Critically Examined by David Strauss. That was a book that did not deny the historicity of Jesus, but did deny the miracle stories. It was a book that stirred up so much controversy. The Earl of Shaftesbury in England described that book as, quote, the most pestilential book ever vomited out of the jaws of hell, end quote. So we know that Nietzsche was not afraid to wander into controversy from a very young age. And that would be one of the hallmarks of his career. After graduating from the Forta School, he went on to matriculate at the University of Bonn. There he pursued studies in theology and philology. Now, he is known as a philosopher, but he was a professor of philology. Philology is the study of the history of language, but it should not be confused with linguistics. Linguistics is the scientific study of all aspects of language. Philology is the study of the history of language told through historical, classical, or canonical texts. So Nietzsche studied how language was used in classical texts, classical writings. In Nietzsche's case, that was primarily Greek poets, some Latin poets, and also the Bible. But he also became influenced by the work of Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's work is still some of the most accessible, some of the most interesting and entertaining to read in all of German philosophy. His work on the world as will and representation would have a profound effect on Nietzsche and would spark his own interest in philosophy, not just philology. Now, since this is a podcast on the death of Nietzsche, I want to talk about his health just for a moment. There really was no indication at this young age that Nietzsche was going to be a sickly adult. It is well documented that he had headaches from the time he was an adolescent. These seemed to be right-sided temporal lobe headaches. They were described as migraines without an aura. But aside from that, there really wasn't much of a warning sign about his health. In fact, in 1867, after studying at the University of Bonn for a few years, he volunteered for service in the Prussian military, specifically in the artillery division. Nietzsche was considered the finest horseman among the recruits. His officers thought he would make the rank of captain very quickly. And so if Nietzsche's military superiors thought that highly of him, thought he had that much potential, it's very unlikely that he came across as sickly or some way compromised. But as he was in that regiment, something happened that I don't really understand. There was an injury that he sustained while trying to leap mount his horse. trying to leap up and mount his horse and ride away, showing off some of those equestrian skills, he struck his chest on the pommel of the saddle. Now, I've looked up the German military saddle from the 1800s, and it's not like the American cowboy pommel. It's not this knob that you tie a rope around. It was simply a raised part at the front of the saddle that kept the rider from sliding forward. Nietzsche somehow struck his chest on this raised part at the front of his saddle and injured himself so badly that he tore muscles in his side and could barely walk upright for a year afterward. He had to quit his military service because of the severity of that injury. According to one source, that injury, striking his chest against the pommel, caused an open wound that subsequently began to, quote, fester, unquote. What that probably meant is the wound became infected, he could have become bacteremic and very, very sick. So there's contradictory information about this injury. According to one account, it tore muscles and made him unable to walk upright for almost a year. According to another account, he had a wound that festered and he became sick and had to quit his military service. Nietzsche returned to the university after this injury to resume his studies because he wasn't in physical shape to carry on his military duties. So when he went back to the university, it was actually the best thing that ever happened to him. It would prove very fortuitous. In 1868, he would meet Richard Wagner. That would become one of the most important relationships of Nietzsche's life. In fact, he would describe his friendship with Wagner, the times that he spent with him, as the best times of his entire life. In a way that we can barely understand, Wagner was a rock star of his time, and he had a house full of hangers-on. And one of those hangers-on was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche worshipped Wagner. Of course, that would all go south, and all go sour in the future. But in those days, Nietzsche was all too happy to be in the orbit of Richard Wagner. In fact, in 1869, Nietzsche wrote a letter in which he described his friendship with Wagner as, quote, the greatest achievement of my life, end quote. Now, another very fortunate event back at the university during those 1860s years is that he met Friedrich Wilhelm Ritschl, a famous philologist. Ritschl was so impressed with Nietzsche that he recommended Nietzsche for a position as chair of philology at the University of Basel. Nietzsche wasn't even a PhD, and he was being recommended as the chair of philology at the University of Basel. That's how highly this mentor, this Ritschl, thought of Nietzsche. Not even 25 years old. Hasn't even completed his PhD. He became one of the youngest chairs of a classics department in European history. And a few years later, while he was at the University of Basel, Nietzsche published his first book called The Birth of Tragedy. Nietzsche's friend and idol Richard Wagner loved the book. He heaped praise on it. But unfortunately, Wagner was not a philologist. And other philologists, far from heaping praise on the book, heaped scorn on it. In fact, in the definitive review of this book, the great philologist Ulrich von Willamowitz, the best-known philologist in Germany or Europe at the time, declared Nietzsche a disgrace to his alma mater and said that his writing was free of any historical sense and rather prone to prophecy, soothsaying, exaggeration, and histrionics. Just a brutal takedown of the book. What he's essentially accusing Nietzsche of is writing the same way that Wagner composed. Small wonder then that Wagner loved the book, and the more proper, restrained, and stodgy academics hated it. Now, it's during this time period when he is chair at Basel that another very important health event occurred in his life. When Nietzsche moved to Basel, he renounced his Prussian citizenship. Despite this, in 1870, he decided to serve as a medical orderly in the Franco-Prussian War. And from August until October in 1870, Nietzsche served as a medical orderly during that war. Depending on who you ask, depending on which resource you quote, this service would have profound and possibly decisive influence on Nietzsche's health later in life. Aside from the obvious psychological stress and trauma he'd experienced as an orderly at the front lines, he contracted dysentery and diphtheria, illnesses which may have compromised his health even long-term after that. But also, now this we don't know, but according to his biographer, Walter Kaufmann, it's very likely that Nietzsche visited a brothel during his time there. And it is possible that that is where Nietzsche contracted syphilis. We'll come back to that, but just keep in mind, Nietzsche possibly contracted syphilis during his time as an orderly in the Franco-Prussian War. So, along with the headaches and the chest injury he sustained trying to vault onto a horse, Nietzsche contracted several infectious diseases, possibly even syphilis, during his time as an orderly in the Franco-Prussian War. He's essentially a walking petri dish by this time. But in his defense, he wasn't the only one, and out of those illnesses that he contracted, the only one that would potentially have had very serious long-term health consequences would have been the syphilis. We don't know for sure that he contracted syphilis. That's the controversy that I'm going to come back to. Once Nietzsche finished his service as a medical orderly during the war, he returned to Basel. There he seemed more comfortable in the company of philosophers instead of philologists. In fact, he was probably more temperamentally suited to be a philosopher than a philologist. We already talked about the brutal review his first work, The Birth of Tragedy, had received at the hands of one of the best-known philologists in Germany. His mind wasn't really suited to close textual analysis. Nitpicky minutiae is what he probably would have considered it. His mind was much more occupied with radical statements, bold proclamations, controversial subjects. That was Friedrich Nietzsche. So he attempted to transfer to the Department of Philosophy, but he was unsuccessful in that. Nietzsche's time as chair of philology at Basel was not the most productive time of his life, probably partly due to his teaching and administrative responsibilities. He did publish several essays, mostly about the work of other people. So he published an essay about David Strauss, one about Richard Wagner, another about Schopenhauer. He did come up, as we said before, with The Birth of Tragedy, his first published book, which was panned by other philologists, but defended by Wagner. Nietzsche would also publish in 1878 his next full-length book, that was Human, All Too Human, a series of aphorisms. And it's at that point that his friendship with Wagner began to cool. Wagner and Nietzsche had initially been united because of their appreciation for Schopenhauer's pessimistic philosophy. This book that Nietzsche published in 1878, Human, All Too Human, began to reject that pessimistic philosophy. And as such, his relationship with Wagner, the most important relationship of his life by his own admission, began to cool. One thing about Nietzsche, he was not a lukewarm kind of guy. He was hot or cold. So it wasn't like him to become indifferent to Wagner. He would actually end up criticizing Wagner, kind of going to war against him in a way. And they would become completely estranged. So all this was going on, but more germane to today's topic. While Nietzsche was in Basel, his health would deteriorate markedly, to the point that he would have to give up his position at Basel. As you can imagine, being the chair of philology is not the most physically demanding job in the world. But even despite its very sedentary nature, Nietzsche couldn't keep up with the demands of the job. According to one biographer, Ferdinand Schiller, quote, "Since his childhood, various disruptive illnesses had plagued him, including moments of short-sightedness, migraine headaches, and violent indigestion. The 1868 riding accident and diseases in 1870, remember those he sustained while an orderly, may have aggravated these persistent conditions which continued to affect him through his years at Basel, forcing him to take longer and longer holidays until regular work became impractical." So in 1879, he resigned from his position at Basel. He was given a pension, fortunately for him, because eventually Nietzsche would become one of the most celebrated and one of the best-selling philosophical authors in history. At that time, he was unknown. His works didn't generate nearly enough income to support him. Not only did he have to rely on his pension, he had to rely on the generosity of friends. And with the meager resources that he had, he lived for several years as an independent author, traveling around Europe, looking for cities that would be most conducive to his health, which for Nietzsche meant Central or Northern Europe during the summer, Southern Europe during the winters. So he spent many summers at Sils Maria or St. Moritz in Switzerland. He spent his winters mostly in the Italian cities of Genoa, Turin, and the French city of Nice. He would occasionally return to his hometown of Naumburg and visit his sister. Nietzsche's sister was just about as strong-minded as Nietzsche was himself, and they had various periods of conflict and resolution during this time. And here I just have to pause to point out something I think is very important about Nietzsche. He's been much maligned as providing somehow the ideological underpinnings for the Nazi movement. He's even been appropriated by the American alt-right. At one time I read that Richard Spencer himself claimed to have been, quote, red-pilled by Nietzsche, end quote. And I would just say that this is a derivative and totally backwards interpretation of Nietzsche. One of the things Nietzsche and his sister Elizabeth argued over the most was politics. Growing up in Bismarck's Germany, as Nietzsche did, two things that he hated were nationalism. Remember, he renounced his Prussian citizenship. He was a man without a nation. He hated nationalism. And another thing that he hated and pointed out very specifically was anti-Semitism. This was a source of conflict with his own sister, Elizabeth, who married a very prominent anti-Semite, and with Wagner. Wagner was anti-Semitic. Nietzsche, when he broke with Wagner, went so far as to write this, quote, "I will have all anti-Semites shot," end quote. So it's very ironic when the very people that Nietzsche said he would have shot tried to legitimize their ideas by an appeal to Nietzsche. In fact, one of the early Nazi thought leaders said, Nietzsche would have made a great Nazi, except for the fact that he wasn't a socialist, wasn't a nationalist, and was totally opposed to racial thinking. It's unfortunate that Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth had editorial control over all of his writings after Nietzsche's death, because she emphasized those far-right elements of Nietzsche's writing that really weren't representative of his thought. And it's taken a while to untangle that, to unpack that. Another trait that's been very unfairly attributed to Nietzsche is misogyny. Nietzsche wasn't a misogynist. In fact, he traveled for several months in the company of a famous feminist author, Malwida von Meisenberg. And with her, he formulated kind of a half-baked plan to start a school for free spirits in the caves below Sorrento. That never came to fruition. But the plans for the school were to have men and women as equals in the school. And consider this, in 1874, while he was in the chair of philology at Basel, a vote was held in the university about the admission of women to the university. Only 4 people voted in favor of allowing women admission to the University of Basel in 1874. One of those 4 was Friedrich Nietzsche. So look, I'm not trying to canonize the guy. He did have his problems. But among those problems were not misogyny or anti-Semitism or a rabid, violent nationalism. So let's return to the life of Nietzsche and his health problems. While he was traveling around Europe, instead of his health improving, it began to deteriorate further and faster. His eyesight failed him. He had to start using a typewriter and then eventually a scribe because he couldn't see what he was writing. Even though Nietzsche's eyesight and general health were deteriorating, his output was becoming much more prolific. He was at the beginning of his most prolific period. He published one book, or one major section of a book, every single year between the years 1878 and 1888, despite the difficulties his health and eyesight caused him. Some of his most famous and influential works come from this period. It's then that he more fully laid out, or developed at least, his ideas about his admiration for the pre-Socratics, his sympathy for the Buddha, the concept of the overman or superman, eternal reoccurrence, and his belief that the Dionysian life, the life of spontaneity, sensuality, heroism, emotional richness, was the highest form of life. That all developed during this later period, when Nietzsche was, by all accounts, extremely ill. It's obvious, too, that Nietzsche loathed his illness. He was contemptuous toward illness in general. Writing in a book toward the end of this period called Twilight of the Idols in 1888, in a section called Morality for Physicians, Nietzsche proclaimed that the sick man was a parasite of society, and that it was indecent and contemptible for a man to vegetate in cowardly dependence on physicians and machines. He went so far as to argue that death should be freely chosen and cheerfully accomplished amongst children and witnesses, instead of the, quote, wretched and revolting comedy that Christianity has made of the hour of death, end quote. Again, you can't help but see a little self-loathing there. Nietzsche might not have been dependent on machines, but he was very dependent on doctors. According to a book called Nietzsche in Illness and in Health by William Goss, Nietzsche at this time had hemorrhoids, suffered from gastric spasms, bad eyesight, often fainted, had fits, was scared of lightning which made him hide under the covers. He sometimes vomited blood, for which he was given quinine. He followed prescribed diets seriously, ate only small pieces of meat with Carlsbad fruit salts, but changed his diets and physicians frequently. In the morning he had his rectum flushed out with cold water. He was treated with leeches applied to his ears, and these apparently partook of his blood, while he partook of his wine. According to biographer Curtis Cate, by 1882, Nietzsche was taking huge doses of opium, but he was still having trouble sleeping. In 1883, while he was staying in Nice, he was writing his own prescriptions for chloral hydrate, which is another powerful sedative, signing them Dr. Nietzsche. When you hear this catalog of illnesses that Nietzsche suffered from, it's almost amazing that he was able to be as productive as he was. He continued to write and publish and carry on correspondences with some of the brightest minds of Europe during this time. But the end would begin for Nietzsche in 1888. On the 5th of April, he took up residence in a small apartment at 20 Via Milano in Turin, Italy. Nietzsche's landlord began to notice that the behavior of this new tenant was becoming increasingly bizarre. He could hear him talking loudly to himself in his room as he would pass by. He would find money in the trash that Nietzsche took out, money that Nietzsche had apparently shredded and thrown away. This landlord, a man named David Fino, reported that he found Nietzsche dancing naked in his room, and Nietzsche demanded he take out all the paintings so that the room looked more like a temple. So the 8 or 9 months that Nietzsche lived in that apartment were pretty bizarre. But you could almost make the case that this was just eccentric behavior, nothing frankly psychotic. But Nietzsche would undergo a total mental collapse, a catastrophic breakdown, on the 3rd of January, 1889. We're not sure the event that triggered this. We know that he was approached by 2 Turinese policemen after he caused some kind of public disturbance. There is a very apocryphal tale that Nietzsche saw a horse being whipped, ran across the plaza, grabbed the horse around the neck and held it, and then collapsed to the ground. But this is apocryphal. We have no way to verify that. All we know for sure is that Nietzsche caused enough of a disturbance that he was accosted and subdued by 2 police officers on the 3rd of January, 1889. The police were going to throw him into prison, but his landlord, again David Fino, persuaded the police to allow him to take Nietzsche home. He said he would watch over Nietzsche, and that's what he did. Nietzsche, meanwhile, began to write a bunch of very bizarre letters. To his friend Meta von Salis, he wrote this, quote, "God is on the earth. Don't you see how all the heavens are rejoicing? I have just seized possession of my kingdom. I've thrown the Pope in prison, and I'm having Kaiser Wilhelm and Bismarck shot." End quote. That's not funny, but it's pretty far out there. Another letter he wrote, this time to a friend, Jacob Burckhardt, quote, "I have had Caiaphas put in chains. Last year, I was crucified in a very drawn-out fashion by the German doctors. Kaiser Wilhelm Bismarck and all the anti-Semites are abolished." End quote. Nietzsche's closest friend to the end of his life was a theologian named Franz Overbeck. Nietzsche, from the semi-confinement of his apartment in Turin, wrote to Overbeck to inform him of the following, quote, "The world will be turned on its head for the next few years. The old God has abdicated. I will be ruling the world from now on." End quote. Pretty matter of fact. Franz Overbeck was a true friend to Nietzsche. When he got this letter and realized something was very wrong with his friend, he rushed to Turin and took Nietzsche back to his house. Overbeck lived in Basel, so Nietzsche first was committed to an asylum in Basel. Later, Nietzsche's mother wanted him closer to her, so she had Nietzsche transferred to an asylum in Jena, which was near her house. Now, the family wasn't rich at this time. Nietzsche was somewhat known, but he wasn't well known. They didn't have money. They couldn't afford first-class rooms for him. So he spent his time among the general population of the asylum, which means he didn't get a lot of personalized attention. To the doctors and staff there, he was just another 44-year-old man with dementia. Patients like Nietzsche were almost always diagnosed with what was called paretic syphilis, or dementia paralytica. In other words, they assumed that somebody that young with that much dementia, that much neurological deterioration, had contracted syphilis. And in 1889, the diagnosis of paretic syphilis was a death sentence. And this is where, for some, the controversy begins. Syphilis was common. Nietzsche might have contracted syphilis in 1870. That was about 20 years before these events. That's about the right time for syphilis to progress to stage 4 neurosyphilis. Nietzsche had many of the telltale signs of neurosyphilis: an expressionless face, slurred speech, confused speech, delusions of grandeur, and muscle weakness so profound that it mimicked paralysis. Nietzsche was found to have all of those features. But he had other evidence of neurosyphilis as well. Pupillary asymmetry was pronounced, and one of his pupils was very slow at reacting to light. So slow light reaction, asymmetrical pupils also were considered telltale signs of syphilis. Based on that information, from that day to this, the most common reason given for Nietzsche's demise is neurosyphilis, end-stage neurological syphilis. There are, however, those who profoundly disagree with that conclusion. One of those who disagrees is Leonard Sachs. In an article published in 2002 in the Journal of Medical Biography, Sachs rejected the idea that neurosyphilis caused Nietzsche's dementia. In this article, yes, Sachs pointed out that Nietzsche had asymmetry of the pupils, but he had had that for 40 years prior to his breakdown. Nietzsche's right eye was slow to react to light, but we know that Nietzsche had been blind in his right eye, or very close to blind in that eye, since the age of 30. What about the sudden onset of bizarre and grandiose delusions? Well, Sachs argued, somewhat convincingly, that Nietzsche had had grandiose delusions for several years. There was no sudden onset like you might expect with neurosyphilis. This was something Nietzsche had evidenced for a long time. Another fact that Sachs points out, Nietzsche lived until the year 1900. So he has his collapse, suffers from paretic syphilis beginning 11 years earlier. It was extremely unusual for anyone to live 11 years after contracting paretic syphilis. Most deaths occurred within 2 years. So the very length of Nietzsche's life argues against paretic syphilis as a diagnosis. According to Sachs, quote, the hypothesis of a meningioma of the right optic nerve accounts for the facts of Nietzsche's case far better than does the diagnosis of paretic syphilis. And to back that up, he points out the fact that Nietzsche had suffered from right-sided headaches from the time he was an adolescent, which we've already pointed out. According to Leonard Sachs, a brain tumor, which of course couldn't have been diagnosed without modern diagnostic imagery, was the cause of Nietzsche's dementia decline and eventual death. So, thus far we have neurosyphilis and a brain tumor. There are, as you might have guessed, other opinions. In 2008, neurologists from Belgium carried out an extensive review of Nietzsche's medical records. They agreed with Sachs that Nietzsche did not have neurosyphilis. His clinical picture was not consistent with neurosyphilis. Instead, they argued that he probably suffered from CADASIL. That's an acronym, C-A-D-A-S-I-L. I'll explain what that means in just a moment. But let me tell you what they pointed out in their research that they found relevant to this diagnosis. First, they mentioned the fact that Nietzsche suffered from migraines starting in childhood. We already mentioned that. In the second half of his life, he had psychiatric illness and depression. We mentioned some of that. During his last years, he had a progressive cognitive decline that ended in profound dementia. Later on, it's obvious to them that he suffered from stroke, either one stroke or several strokes. They also pointed out something that I was unaware of until reading their paper. That is, Nietzsche's father, who I said died when Nietzsche was only 5 years old, died of a stroke at the age of 36. And that is where the diagnosis of CADASIL comes in for them. Because what CADASIL stands for is cerebral autosomal dominant arteriopathy with subcortical infarcts and leukencephalopathy. In other words, a brain disease that you inherit that affects the arteries, that causes areas of your brain to have blood clots so they don't get blood supply, and you end up with damage to your white matter. Nietzsche's father had it, they say, or they posit at least, and Nietzsche himself suffered from that. That's what led to his dementia and his death eventually. So now there are 3 explanations, but never fear, of course, there are many, many more. A paper out of Austria in 2009 argued that Friedrich Nietzsche suffered from another acronym, MELAS, mitochondrial encephalomyopathy with lactic acidosis and stroke-like episodes. This is a disease of the little cell powerhouses, the mitochondria. It primarily affects the neurological system and the muscles. It could be inherited primarily from the mother, but it could also be a mutation. No family history whatsoever. Its onset is usually in older children. And this is interesting. Its onset presents as recurrent attacks of a migraine-like headache, anorexia, vomiting, and seizures. Because of the muscle energy abnormalities, people with MELAS often have an accumulation of lactic acid in the blood. Now that could lead to vomiting, abdominal pain, fatigue, muscle weakness, and difficulty breathing. So this at least takes into account the frequent bouts of severe indigestion that Nietzsche complained of. And another thing to note, Nietzsche began to have headaches and vision disturbances in childhood. Many people with MELAS don't show severe symptoms until after the age of 40. We know that Nietzsche was 44 when his severe breakdown occurred. People with this disease can also live several years after its first manifest, which is consistent with Nietzsche also. So MELAS, M-E-L-A-S, bringing the grand total of potential causes of Nietzsche's dementia and death up to 4. In the year 2012, Hungarian scientists evaluated 6 different hypotheses concerning Nietzsche's death. The 4 we already covered, plus bipolar disorder with vascular dementia and a hereditary form of frontotemporal dementia. Their conclusion? We don't know. Go to the family plot in Rocken, Germany, exhume the body, do forensic analysis, take some DNA specimens, and find out exactly what killed Friedrich Nietzsche. And I will say that's a very promising approach, but as of yet, the collective will does not exist to disturb the remains of Friedrich Nietzsche to satisfy our curiosity. So then, what exactly did kill Friedrich Nietzsche? As I said earlier, I was going to be the fool who wades in where angels fear to tread, and offer my opinion of what it was. And with all due respect to the research that has been performed by the various authors I mentioned, the fact that they took into account his indigestion, his father's death, his headaches, all of these things, and that they were able to tie it into what seems like a fairly neat clinical picture of various diseases, I believe that Friedrich Nietzsche died of neurosyphilis. Now, I realize that may be anticlimactic, and I fully appreciate all of these diagnoses as possibly causes behind Nietzsche's dementia and death. It is certainly possible that he had melas, that the mitochondria in his muscles and neurological system were all messed up. But I mean, let's face it, that's a zebra. That's a rare condition, and it's usually present at a very young age. Diagnosis past the age of 20 is pretty rare, and syphilis was a much more common condition at the time Nietzsche suffered his breakdown. It could have indeed been an optic meningioma. That is possible. I cannot prove or rule out that possibility. But really, an optic meningioma with psychosis, catatonia, catastrophic breakdown of all mental faculties, not very likely. Catacil, the cerebral autosomal dominant problem with the arteries, that is certainly possible also. That can lead to many of the symptoms that Nietzsche evidenced. But I would ask, where were the seizures? Nietzsche was not known to have suffered many seizures, and yet catacil involves seizures. The aura associated with the headaches, the migraines from catacil, has a profound and pronounced aura. Nietzsche's headaches are specifically described as migraines without aura. There was no aura. Does that prove it was not catacil? Absolutely not. I cannot prove it wasn't a tumor. I cannot prove it wasn't melas. I can't prove it wasn't catacil or bipolar disorder or any of the other etiologies that have been hypothesized. By selectively focusing on some symptoms and ignoring others, you can make the case for many different illnesses. And so I'm left to decide what is the most likely. In my own mind, of course. Nobody cares what I decide. But in my own mind, I want to decide what is the most likely. Not pick out one or two historical descriptions or symptoms here and there and try to make a strong case out of it. At the time, syphilis was very common. It would take a very long time indeed to name all of the famous historical figures who suffered from syphilis. According to an article called A Brief History of Syphilis in the Journal of Life and Medicine, this list is staggering. It is thought that Schopenhauer, specific to today's discussion, the philosopher that Nietzsche so admired, Arthur Schopenhauer, probably contracted syphilis at a very young age. It might have been the underlying cause of his well-documented misogyny. The poet Keats, writers including Dostoevsky, Heinrich Heine, Oscar Wilde, Baudelaire, artists including Gauguin, Van Gogh, Goya, composers including Schubert and Beethoven, are either known or very strongly suspected by the medical evidence to have had syphilis. And this list is just beginning. Doesn't include any of the kings, presidents, conquerors, and so many other famous figures who are known to have had, or very strongly suspected to have had, syphilis. The author Deborah Hayden, in her 2003 book, Pox, Genius, Madness, and the Mysteries of Syphilis, talks about and points out that Nietzsche's most productive year, the heights of his genius, were realized right before his breakdown. That, she argues, is a hallmark of syphilis. Her case to prove that Nietzsche suffered all his adult life from syphilis is as strong as any posthumous medical history can be. Nietzsche was diagnosed with syphilis at a time when clinical familiarity with the disease was at its height. This disease abounded. If you have ever studied syphilis, you know that it progresses through identifiable stages. Well, Hayden, in what I think is convincing detail, traces Nietzsche's progress through each of these stages. As early as 1867, at the age of 23, Nietzsche went to see his eye doctor, Dr. Otto Eisner. Dr. Eisner reported not only about Nietzsche's vision problems, but he reported that Nietzsche had a chancre, a painless open sore in the private areas that is known to be the first stage of syphilis. Nietzsche's own letter from that point on, from 1867 on, until his breakdown, pretty much describe a textbook case of secondary syphilis. He complains of pain, skin sores, weakness, loss of vision that were classically seen in syphilis sufferers. In 1889, when Nietzsche broke down, he was taken to the clinic of a paresis, a syphilis expert. That expert reviewed his record and made a note in his chart, 1867, syphilis infect. That corresponded to Dr. Eisner's initial diagnosis and also provided enough time for syphilis to go through the stages from primary to secondary to tertiary. So when you consider the sum of the historical record, all of the evidence that exists about Nietzsche's condition, I have to say that syphilis is the most likely diagnosis. All of the valiant efforts to rehabilitate his reputation after the fact notwithstanding. And what I mean by that is, there was a time, I don't know, Victorian, Elizabethan time, when accusing somebody of dying of syphilis would have been almost a refutation of their life's work. I hope we're well past that time. This has been the History of Being Human podcast. Thank you again for listening. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong. Contact me at thobhpodcast@gmail.com.